Welcome. My name is Dr. Leslie Jones, and I have the pleasure of sharing some time with you over the coming weeks and months as we explore the topics in this unit of study, children, families and communities. Regardless of where your career may take you, working with and for children and their families situated in their local communities will be a major part of your career. Building expertise in supporting children and their families in their local context will provide you with some of the most rewarding experiences during your career, and at times, some interesting challenges. This unit will challenge you to think beyond what you think you know about children, families, and communities, to look more deeply at the perceptions, values, and beliefs that you and others hold of children and families, and to understand the many influences that impact our work. Critical to this thinking is the role of public policy, and in this unit we'll stretch your thinking beyond just compliance to public policy and regulations, but to examine this with a really critical eye and to build a cognitive awareness of how public policy and societal influences position children and their families and shape our professional practice. Children have been positioned within power relationships, as have their families, throughout history. So the beginning part of this unit of study will be looking at exactly how those children and families have been positioned over time during Australian history. So let's get started with a look at children then and now. So let's begin to explore this notion of children then and now. So what do we even mean by the notion of child and childhood? You can see the quote by Giddens that talks about childhood as being a biological reality defined by physiological immaturity of infants and young children. And while that's obviously really true, I would like to stretch our thinking to begin with that childhood is much more than that. Childhood is a concept developed and perpetuated by adults within social, temporal and cultural context. Childhood is the state of not being an adult and is understood and positioned as it relates to adulthood. Child and childhood have held very different positions throughout history. These historical positions still echo in parts of how we view children even today. Aries suggests that up until medieval time, the notion of childhood did not even really exist. And if you look at the artwork from this period, children are actually depicted as small people, and they're not childlike. Certainly, children were treated as adults from when they were extremely young in this period of time. Childhood, it seems, ended as soon as children were physically independent from needing to be fed and toileted by mothers. How childhood has changed over the centuries. Children throughout the ensuing centuries have been seen as a threat, a possession, an asset, a precious gift to be protected at all costs, our future, the work of nationhood, and in more contemporary times, citizens in their own right, autonomous and agentic, self-determining and empowered. Families have also undergone significant changes, from self-sufficient contained units in the agrarian period to large families of the Industrial Revolution and to the nuclear families of the 20th century, and to the diverse range of family structures we know and work with today. It is impossible to consider the construct of child and childhood without folding in the role of parenting and motherhood and fatherhood. These two have undergone incredible change. Would it surprise you to know that many of the changes and influences that have unfolded for how we understand children, childhood and family still to this day influence our contemporary lives? They do. And I can hear you already saying to yourselves, so what? And that's a good question to ask. By understanding this past and its continued influence us on today, we, as working professionals, are better placed to examine, understand and respond to people's divergent views, stereotypes and bias, including our own. This type of critical analysis of our own and others' perspectives help us to build deeper, richer practice and professional expertise. As you look at the historical continuum, you can see that there are some major milestones along the way. In each of these milestones, children are positioned by the adult world in certain ways that over centuries have influenced the way that we think and feel about children and childhood in general. From medieval times, where there was very little differentiation between child and adult, and therefore not much evidence of how these people viewed and positioned children, consider what life may have been like when children were not treated as different to adults. What might the pros and cons have been? The growth of Puritanism in the 16th and 17th century gave rise to one of the most dominant views of child and childhood. Based in religious doctrine of the day, children were positioned as being born of original sin, that is, inherently bad, and in the need of incredibly authoritarian parenting and harsh punishment for their own well-being. In contrast, the Age of Enlightenment saw the emergence of another dominant and enduring construct of child and childhood. Childhood here begins to be positioned as something precious and somewhat romanticised, and the concept of the innocent child emerges. Here, children begin to be positioned as blank slates, just waiting to be filled with knowledge through tutorship, logic, and respect. This really strong binary concept between children as being innocent or evil is a predominant position between that in many ways still remains today. We see it replicated in mass media, from advertisements that depict children in beautiful settings living an innocent and perfect childhood, juxtaposed to those depicted as out of control, noisy, naughty even, with stressed parents just trying to cope. And we see these generalisations everywhere. By the 19th century, children's position is being added to with the influences of the Industrial Revolution. Children and families in their millions migrated or were displaced from rural communities to flood into the new cities and are put to work in the factories. And so a new construct of child emerges as an asset and a resource for industry and economy. However, children here are also seen as a community threat. The construct of the child as a threat emerges as a direct relationship to the children roaming the streets. The gangs were a disruptor to the adult world of law and order. These two societal pressures and new constructs of child ultimately lead to the introduction of mass schooling, a place where children can be contained in large numbers and controlled by adults, trained in the basics to be good workers, compliant to adult authority, and occupied to be off the streets. These enduring constructs have helped shape an enduring view of what a good or bad child or childhood actually consists of. And to this day, we see many public initiatives to address issues such as child delinquency, school engagement and participation, and preparation for future working careers. It's fair to say that the adult world continues to feel the best place for children of a certain age is behind the school fence, fully engaged in their schooling and preparing for adulthood. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an evidence and an example of using critical thinking. Engaging in critical thinking about these concepts means we should be examining the status quo. Does these century-old constructs still fit the modern world? We certainly know that school doesn't fit every child well, yet the structure and function of schooling remains relatively unchanged. So we should consider why this might be so. Finally, as we consider the last few decades, we see the emergence of some significant and fast-moving influences on how children and childhood are positioned in our communities. The introduction of mass media, social media, the internet, the child's rights movement, and consumerisms, not to mention the changes to family structure, have influenced the way the adult world thinks of and relates to the concept of child and childhood. In many ways, there are still new influences. Where they take us in terms of how we position children is still emerging, and much more critical debate is needed. Thinking more about contemporary childhoods, we've moved from a time in history where there was little or no differentiation between adult and child to living in contemporary societies and communities where childhood has become ever more discrete. From neonate, infant, toddler, early childhood, middle childhood, teenager, and pubescent. We not only understand the biological differences that some of these categories have now generated, but continue to construct and reconstruct the many positions that children hold in our communities within this very nuanced view. And so, as we consider how we view and understand the positions of children in a contemporary communities, Soren suggests that there are a number of changing images of childhood that have moved beyond the classic constructs of child as evil or child as completely innocent. Consider the following contemporary positions of child that Soren puts forward. Can you see them depicted in mass media and public policy? So the notion of the snowballing child, the child that just keeps escalating, the out of control child, the miniature adult, the adult in training, child as a commodity, child as victim, and the agentic child. The ways in which children and childhood are constructed and understood influences parenting practices, public policy, and the ways in which adults and society in general respond towards children. Public policy and individual values and belief impact on the day-to-day professional practice and service delivery that children and their families engage with. As someone who'll be working with and for children, it's really critical that you begin to deeply think about how you see children. What are your values and your beliefs about children and childhood and families? For you, what constitutes a normal or a good childhood or child? And conversely, what gives you rise to concern about what constitutes a poor childhood or a poor child? What makes a good family? And are these views just replication of your own lived experience? If so, there are alternatives that may be a better fit for your professional practice. The likelihood as a working professional of you working only with families and children who have very similar values to your own is remote. Critically reflecting on the content of this unit will assist you in being able to value children and families in all their shapes and sizes and cultures and experience in meaningful, informed and authentic ways. Thank you for listening, and I'm really looking forward to sharing our next time together in the next lecturette.